Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Simón Bolívar Part 3, Leavings and Returns by Extra History. This is Part 3 in their series on Simón Bolívar. Last time we saw the revolution didn't exactly go as planned. There was a bit of treachery from Francisco de Miranda. Him and Bolívar fell out, but Bolívar managed to flee from his country before being captured or killed. This will not be the last time Bolívar finds himself in that position. His career is certainly one of ups and downs. Now, before we get into this video, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
As the Jesus, Maria, y San Jose pulled away from the shores of Venezuela, one man stood on deck, looking back. He was a grimmer man, a harder man than the youth full of verve who, a handful of years earlier, had stumbled onto the shores of London. His wealth was gone, his power was gone, but his dreams were yet his.
And like I said, Simón Bolívar's career, it is not a simple trajectory upwards. It will be very up and down. This will not be the last time he finds himself fleeing his country to avoid, well, being killed or being captured. He will amass an amazing amount of power and influence by the end, but it's not an easy rise to the top.
He vowed to return to those shores,
And he
then
will.
turned away.
I will say, you could say a lot of things about Bolívar, and we'll probably get into some of the complexities of his character and legacy throughout this series, but this man was absolutely driven by his cause. I mean, he was truly passionate. He would always return to try and fight for what he felt was Latin American freedom and prosperity. He was truly, truly committed. Now, as we'll see, not everybody agreed with his methods, not everybody agreed with the particular vision he had. You know, you can definitely debate those things, but this was a man committed to the cause. That is undeniable.
His defeat has given him a new vision, a new idea of what liberation must look like. He no longer thinks of Venezuela alone. He now thinks of all of Latin America.
Yeah, now we're getting the Simón Bolívar that is so famous, you know, is known in the history books. A man who didn't just think about Venezuela, but really thought about the entirety of Latin America. This is more true to the Simón Bolívar we all know and remember.
He realizes that no one nation is enough to fight off the might of Spain, even declining and corrupt as it is. Liberty would have to come to all nations, or none. He has become pragmatic.
And I will say, that is sort of, among many things, one of the exceptional things about the American Revolution. I mean, all these revolutions in this era are truly exceptional. These rare, monumental events. But a difference here is that, as we're going to see, these revolutions, you know, they are revolutions plural, involve a variety of different Latin American nations rising up together and sometimes a little separately, but they are rising up around the same time against this, well, one empire, the Spanish Empire. We also have Brazil and the Portuguese Empire, but that's a little bit of a separate story, right? Though, of course, there is a relationship. With the United States, the 13 colonies, well, we remember them as the 13 colonies because those weren't all the British colonies. The British had many other colonies in the Americas, and it was those 13 that rose up. So it's kind of interesting because Britain, though of course Britain would face other revolts, right? But it would retain the rest of its empire, and of course it would grow its empire in some places. So that is a bit of an interesting difference we see here.
If this was going to work, Latin America couldn't just be a loose federation as the fledgling United States had become after its revolution. They would need to be a strong, centralized power. They would need strong leadership, with an executive who could act swiftly and decisively to pull the people together and deflect any Spanish threat. But before he could act on any of...
Right, so that is the vision of Simón Bolívar, and that will remain, like, relatively true throughout the rest of his career. Of course, that vision will undergo changes depending on context, and Bolívar himself will change over time, but largely what Simón Bolívar wants is a unified Latin America under a single centralized government with a strong executive, right? This is where he becomes a lot more controversial. Now, of course, there were some people who didn't even want independence at all, but even among those who wanted independence or were willing to tolerate independence, there were big disagreements about what that independence would look like. And we're kind of, I mean, this is a very simplified way to think about it, but you can imagine a spectrum between centralized government and decentralized government, right? So at one end is Simón Bolívar, who wants the strong centralized government with a strong executive. At the other end is a vision of a decentralized Latin America where each of these countries are their own independent thing with their own independent governments. Now, there is, of course, a million different variations of this vision, right? Maybe you have a loose confederation, maybe you have a centralized government, but there's some room for autonomy, right? There's a lot of different versions of government you could create here. But this is where people at the time found a lot of issue with Bolivar. Now, he certainly had allies and followers who believed in his vision of a centralized government, but he had a lot of people who did not want that. Of course, as they've mentioned, there's a lot of comparisons to the American Revolution for sort of obvious reasons. One of those is that this is also an issue that the fledgling United States faced. Of course, America's first sort of founding document, well, got stuff like the Declaration of Independence, but they went with the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution. And the Articles of Confederation set up a government that was far more a loose confederation of states. Now, in the case of the United States, that didn't really work out, which is why we have the Constitution, which created a much stronger centralized government. Now, of course, Latin America is in some ways in a similar situation, but it's also in a different situation. So one of the big questions of this era is what exactly are they going to do? Will they follow in the footsteps of the United States? Will they modify what the US did? Will they go a completely different direction? This is a massive debate among the revolutionary leaders.
This, he had to get himself back into the action. He was stuck in Curacao, a small island held by the British off the coast of Venezuela. And
you'll see Curacao is where a lot of these revolutionaries flee. Because, during this era and before this era, you have a lot of revolutionaries, or even just sort of like liberal thinkers who get themselves into a bit of trouble. They have to flee. You'll see a lot of them flee to Curacao. One reason is proximity. It's relatively close by, but you also have the protection of that British government, which is sort of willing to shelter these revolutionary types most of the time.
He was penniless. The Spanish had confiscated all of his property, his mines, his lands, his slaves, all gone. He had bought his way into this revolution. How was he to continue without those funds? He was able to borrow a small amount from a merchant, just enough to hire a boat and equip a small band of men to sail for New Granada, where he had heard the revolution was still alive. And the revolution he found there was indeed alive, but it was fractured. Different groups vying for power in different regions. The whole country splintered. He had work to do. He rapidly won the admiration of their nominal president.
And isn't that funny? Simón Bolívar, a guy who, once again, of course, I'm talking about the Latin American revolutions, right? So clearly there's a connection between all these different revolutions, but in some ways they are also separate. And it's so interesting to see this guy who tried a revolution in his home country, it failed, and then he just hopped over to another country and said, all right, let's do a revolution here. Now, it does make sense because they are all connected, and that's how Bolivar thinks about it, as this one sort of unified event, but it is sort of interesting to think about.
And he and his band were commissioned to fight in the New Granada Rebellion. The local commanders, however, were none too eager to see this foreign revolutionary, one who had just handed his former commander to the Spanish. They sent him off to garrison a small town. But this time he would do more than merely dream of glory. He wrote, spreading his ideas to the world. He socialized, gaining the support of the local elite. And he walked among the people, gaining the support of the poor, the indigent, the downtrodden. His small band of 70 quickly grew to 200. Then he saw an opportunity. A group of royalists had occupied a position on a nearby river, cutting off revolutionary forces. He wrote to command to ask permission to dislodge them. His request was denied. he went anyway. His men built small boats and they paddled up the river. He sent one man ahead to offer the enemy garrison commander, a garrison which numbered 500 by the way, an
Ooh.
opportunity to surrender. The man just laughed and turned this envoy away. Then Bolivar's men came around the bend and leapt out of their boats, guns blazing. The garrison scattered in terror, leaving behind a large cache of weapons and munitions.
See, Bolivar, I mean, he's already faced combat. We saw that last episode, but he's really cutting his teeth here. He's learning the ways of revolutionary warfare, building up his small band of men into, over time, a much bigger band of men, and picking up supplies and weapons as he goes. You know, once again, you can make comparisons to, say, the American Revolution. These are often very scrappy, sometimes guerrilla-style campaigns, sometimes not. You know, we're dealing with relatively low supplies, usually low manpower. There's a lot of problems to work around. You have to operate in a particular way. Of course, the disadvantage that the Empire faces, in this case the Spanish Empire, is that they are dealing with colonies all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from their mainland. And so, while they are certainly better supplied, and, you know, they have a lot of well-trained troops and garrisons and forts, it can be pretty difficult to resupply and send more men to retake some of these forts.
Bolivar turned to the people of the occupied town and exhorted them to join his cause, and again his ranks grew. Over the next 15 days, he waged a lightning campaign. His men were like phantoms. They moved faster than anybody expected, and they always approached from ways thought impassable. Thick jungle, pestilential swamps. Each time they struck, a new town fell. And with each town, his small force grew more towards becoming an army.
Yeah.
At the end of those 15 days, he had liberated 500 kilometers of vital riverway, and changed the course of the Granadan fight for independence. But his conquests had taken him right to the border of Venezuela, and his mind again began to turn to liberating his homeland. After a couple more brilliant victories and the final assurance of liberty for Granada, he began to march towards his suffering nation.
Hey, look, Simón Bolívar had a vision of a unified Latin America, but of course he was always most inclined towards his home, Venezuela. You can't blame the man, right? He wanted to grant independence to his home country. That was his first goal, and he wants to go back to that.
For in Venezuela, the reprisals of the Spanish had been swift and brutal. Bolivar may have had the connections to escape, but most weren't so lucky. Mass executions, rapine, and plunder were rampant. Not even children were spared. But most of the Granadans didn't want to fight to liberate another country, so with only 500 ill, undersupplied, and undertrained troops, Bolivar crossed once again into his homeland.
And by the way, this is where you're already seeing some of the issues with Bolivar's vision for Latin America, right? This idea of a unified, essentially a unified country. A lot of these people who were perfectly happy to fight for New Granada, their home, they don't view it the same way he does. They say, right, but we don't want to go fight for Venezuela. You know, we fought for our home. We did our thing. You know, best of luck. Like, you know, not like they have any love for the Spanish Empire, but a lot of people are not necessarily willing to put their life on the line going to fight for the independence of somewhere else. Now, some are, right? We don't want to make a sweeping generalization. Like I said, some people are. Some people believe in Bolivar's vision. You also have a whole lot of professional revolutionaries and mercenaries who are willing to fight in any war that pops up, but a lot of people, a lot of the rank and file, are not.
Through guile, surprise, and fear, he rapidly won another string of victories, swelling his ranks once again. But Bolivar's earlier losses had changed him.
Although, of course, personal loyalty to Bolivar, especially over time, will change that a bit, right? You have some men who, you know, however they feel about revolution everywhere in a unified Latin America, they might be personally loyal to Simón Bolívar, and they will follow him into battle wherever he goes.
He was a sterner man, a grimmer man, and he would meet the Spanish atrocity for atrocity. Soon after entering Venezuela, he declared, "Our vengeance shall rival Spanish ferocity.
Yeah.
Our goodwill is at last exhausted, and since our oppressors compel us to mortal warfare, they shall disappear from America, and our land shall be purged of the monsters that infest it. Our hate shall be inexorable. and our war shall be to the death. And he decreed a death sentence for all Spaniards who did not turn against Spain. It galvanized the revolutionaries.
Yeah, this is a rather infamous proclamation of Bolivar. I'm sure you can understand why. One of those moments that was controversial and has sort of remained controversial in the historiography. People continue to debate the merits of this idea. Of course, it's very brutal, but you've got sort of an ongoing war. I mean, you can have a lot of different opinions on it, but yeah, this is something that has been remembered and has remained controversial.
And drove Republicans to his cause, but it also laid the groundwork for a legacy of blood.
Yeah.
Still, his lightning campaign dashed Spanish resistance at Mérida, Trujillo, Barquisimeto, and Valencia, and soon, less than a year after he had slipped off in disgrace, he was returning to Caracas.
Surely he won't have to flee again. Surely that wouldn't happen.
The conquering hero. He was celebrated in the streets. He had liberated Venezuela. But the work was not yet done.
Never.
The Spanish still...
Bolivar's work is never done. I mean, you see these type of driven leaders throughout history, whether you're talking about Napoleon or a Julius Caesar or whoever. Hey, the work is never done. They've always got more stuff to do, frankly, until their death. That's true for all three guys I just mentioned.
Had a holdout 100 miles away. Slave uprisings had broken out against the white-led rebellion, and, as would prove worst of all, the Legion of Hell had declared for the Spanish cause. And their name barely does them justice. They were the brutal horsemen of the plains, owing no loyalty to anyone, living in the saddle like Mongols, and holding life, both their own and those they faced, cheap. They were a nightmare that stalked Venezuela. Armed with fire-hardened spears rather than any modern weaponry, they would show up at a town, run down the men as they fled, rape the women, and play cruel games where they would impale the children on their lances, leaving the infants there as a gruesome totem for when they rode into battle.
Yeah, these guys, they're sort of like mercenary types, or I should say, they were not particularly ideological, right? Which is why their allegiances were sort of in question, at this time loyal to the Spanish, but I do believe a lot of them were mixed race. A lot of them were non-white, and so we talked about this last time, sort of this white-led elite revolution didn't really hold much appeal to them, and so they were willing to go and fight on behalf of the Spanish. Yeah.
And they neither gave nor expected quarter. When they would fight the Republican troops, they would throw themselves at them in mounted waves, overwhelming their firearms with sheer mass and ferocity. And when they won, not a man was spared. And so now, Bolivar's proclamation that this would be a war to the death had truly come to be. But instead of it being a war to the death with the Spanish, it was a war to the death with his own people, becoming a civil war spilling out on racial lines. Because his troops, too, slaughtered their prisoners, and murdered any of the Legion of Hell that would fall into their hands, often dismembering them and leaving pieces on spikes for all to see. In the midst of all this...
I will say, I mean, it's a revolution. Oftentimes, revolution involves some sort of civil conflict, civil war, right? You can think of the French Revolution, with the counter-revolution in the Vendée that led to years of brutal fighting and brutal, extremely violent repression by the revolutionary government. You can think of the American Revolution. I mean, it wasn't like 100% of Americans were patriots. The stat I often hear thrown around, but I don't know if this is actually true. You hear it's like a third, a third, a third. A third were patriots, a third were loyalists, and a third were neutral. I don't know if that is true. I'm willing to bet that most people were probably neutral of some kind, and then you had a minority force of patriots and Tories, and in the American Revolution, it wasn't just like Americans fighting Brits. First of all, that distinction wasn't very clearly made at that point. You had Americans, or colonial Brits, or whatever you want to identify them as, fighting other Americans, right? So, you know, there usually is a sort of civil infighting aspect of this, though this is particularly brutal in this case.
Any pretense to republicanism disappeared, as Bolivar centralized all power in himself. Meanwhile, atrocities continued to mount. Spaniards wore the ears of the dead as trophies. The Legion left whole villages with nothing but ghosts. And he himself ordered 1,000 prisoners, not even POWs, decapitated one by one. And with each passing day, his hold was slipping. Every victory in the field was offset by the fact that the Legion and the slave uprisings could recruit men far faster than he could.
Yeah, and this is another controversial part of Bolivar's legacy that we will discuss throughout this series, is this idea of authoritarianism, right? So, Bolivar's vision for a unified Latin America with a centralized government and a strong executive, a lot of people accused him of essentially wanting to make himself the authoritarian leader of the continent, perhaps even a king at the very extremes, and we do see a rather authoritarian style of leadership from Bolivar throughout his career. Now, I'd say it's a lot more complicated than that, especially later on when we start to move away from warfare and towards politics. I think Bolivar will show he's a lot more than a simple authoritarian. I think he really did have principles, and he believed in that style of government. And also, I think you could make an argument that some of Bolivar's heavy-handed governance was maybe justified by the circumstances he was dealing with. Now, that's always a controversial proposition, right? There are debates about this at the time, right? Bolivar was a controversial figure at the time, and there are debates about this today. Though I will say, among sort of in popular history, Bolivar is a greatly revered figure. I mean, he's remembered as this heroic revolutionary, but if you get into the historical debates, you know, he is more a complicated figure, as everybody is. So I think it's a very complicated question. I don't think Bolivar was just a simple power-grabbing authoritarian. I think that's a vast oversimplification. But there was certainly some of that to him and his career. And, we'll see some of that, and we'll get more of a chance to talk about that in the rest of this series.
As the vast mixed race and black population saw an opportunity to attack those who had oppressed them. The economy was in tatters and couldn't supply his army or even build new guns, and every victory came at a cost in irreplaceable men. Soon he was putting 12-year-olds under arms. Venezuela was awash in blood, and attrition and time took their toll. On June 15, 1814, waves of horsemen crashed through Republican lines at La Puerta, a critical pass. A month later, they were in Caracas. Panic filled the streets. People fled, run down by horsemen as they tried to get away. Bolivar escaped and rallied his troops to one more time put up a desperate last stand. But by now, the forces he'd been using to bottle up the Spanish had been siphoned off, and the Spanish Royalists' forces had been able to recoalesce.
Uh-oh.
In the final battle, heavily outnumbered, Bolivar's Republicans sold themselves dearly, but it would not be enough. And so the Second Republic collapsed. Not from the might of the Spanish, but from the weight of its own internal divisions. And for the second time, Bolivar found himself on a boat, sailing to New
There he
Granada,
goes.
looking back at a republic that might have been.
I told you guys when we started this video that it would not be the last time Bolivar would have to flee. And there we go again. Like I said, his career was not a straight shot to the top. There were a lot of ups and downs. We saw some of the ups in this video, but now we're also reaching some of the downs. Another great episode of this series. I will say, of course, with all of these extra history videos, right, we're doing a 6-part series, and each one of the original videos is about 10 minutes long. So there is an immense amount of information that is being skipped over here. I mean, Simón Bolívar's career spanned a long period of time and was absolutely chock full of different accomplishments, events. There is so much to cover that you couldn't even get remotely close, even if we had a documentary of a couple hours. I mean, there is so much to cover, so just keep that in mind. Like I said, Bolivar's a complicated figure, and we can't cover all that complexity here, and there are a lot of events that we're missing as well. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind with, frankly, any sort of historical content you consume, right? Nothing can include everything, but especially YouTube videos, they're made to be accessible, which is great, but it also means that you miss a lot of information. Anyway, I did very much enjoy this one. I hope you guys did as well, and if you did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I'll see y'all again next time. Goodbye.